alternatives, just such as one consumer good or another, and such as consumption or leisure. Choices by people as producers are treated in a similar spirit, but those choices are treated even more simplistically. The fact that people get satisfactions from altruistic acts complicates this approach, this utility maximizing approach to choice behavior, but does not invalidate it. The fact that so-called agents, something ominous about that word, agents, may be operating with wrong expectations so that they are in expectational disequilibrium, does not deny that agents behave in ways aimed at maximizing expected utility. The trouble arises from a different aspect of neoclassical economics. In the neoclassical world of Ricardo and Walras, everything has become known. Hence, one does not crave new experience since there is nothing not already experienced. One does not seek novel goods to try because there are no novel goods anymore. It's a jaded world that the neoclassical theory of utility maximization describes. Now, I don't know how things are these days in Guacamora or Bali or Bhutan. It may be that their economies have come to be continually disrupted by new products and methods coming from parts of the West. However, in an economy possessing dynamism, which I won't stop to define carefully, but you can see what, I think you can grasp what I mean by it. In an economy possessing dynamism, new ideas are conceived and developed for tryout in the market, after they've been tried in tastings, perhaps, or in wind tunnels and so forth. There is a cornucopia of experiences to embark on, novel products and methods to devise and to try. This is a world of exciting opportunities and challenge. In the inclusive economies, among these, it is not only the elites who perceive opportunities and challenges. Most participants get caught up in the spirit of ingenuity, imagination, exploration, experimentation, and venturing. And some new ideas may crop up right at the grassroots, so to speak, as Hayek implied. The values held by people participating in a dynamic or modern economy are various. Ron Inglehart's World Values Surveys shows diversity of values within a country, not just across countries. There are competing conceptions of the good life. I think some of us here at the conference are groping toward a lexicon and a catalog of those conceptions. I wonder whether we might agree that in any country, a prevalent conception of the good life, of how to conduct your life, is an element of what we might call the country's economic culture. I believe that some of the presentations in the Saturday sessions address elements of the economic culture beyond conceptions of the good life. I wonder also whether we might agree that there are good cultures and bad cultures, as Ruth Benedict came around to believing. A bad culture is one that does not allow or does not support adequately an economy offering the good life. A big question is whether some nations lack an economy of dynamism. They only play catch-up with the economies that do have dynamism, because the necessary conception of the good life is lacking strength there, or because the economic culture, or maybe the political culture, contains elements in them that are impediments or blocks to society's embrace and continuing support of a highly modern economy, an economy of high dynamism. The economic culture of a country may, it seems to me, throw up too many constraints to realize the good life, even when the conception of the good life is agreed upon. Well, I'm hoping to learn quite a lot from this conference. Thank you very much. I think people should come up. Well, the next on the program is Marty Seligman. Martin is here. There he is. Sorry.
See if I can find my PowerPoint. That's mine.
Okay. He is a famous theoretical psychologist. I guess you don't say that in psychology. Anyhow, he's a famous psychologist. He's long-time chaired professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Elected not long ago president of the American Association of Psychologists, and a great force in the profession. And in the past few years, he's turned his attention to the sources of happiness, thus turning psychology away from the abnormal and the unhappy to the healthy and the happy. Professor Seligman.
Keep them pretty high. Don't.
I just think it's
Yeah. And then how do I get the PowerPoint on?
This one?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, as all of you probably know, Schopenhauer and Freud argued that the best we could ever do in life was to minimize our suffering, that the highest aspiration one could have was not to be miserable. I'm going to suggest today that this is empirically false and morally bankrupt. And I'm only going to talk about it within psychology. I confess my ignorance of economics, but I sense from what I've read of Ned's material that we may be after similar issues in the social sciences generally. So here's the structure of what I'll do in about a half an hour. I'm going to talk about the possibility of well-being as a policy goal, as a national goal, or as an individual goal. Well-being, as I'll talk about it, is different from minimizing your misery and your suffering. Those things get in the way. And I think the removal of disabling conditions is a worthwhile goal in individual life as well as policy, but it's different from the building of enabling conditions. And I'll try to make that distinction. What Schopenhauer and Freud had hoped, essentially, underneath what they said was somehow if you got rid of all the disabling conditions, then you'd get well-being. And it turns out that's empirically and clinically false. I'm all for removing disabling conditions, but I want to also distinguish about enabling conditions. And I'm by no means predicting that there will be a positive human future. But if there is to be one, then I think the question of in what would it consist, what would we measure, and what would be built become the, I guess, a theoretical empirical question for psychologists. So that's the substance of what I'll talk about. So I'll ask about what to build. Can we do better than the word happiness, which I think has become vacuous or used in so many different ways as not to be useful? And I'm going to suggest that if we're interested in what free people choose to do, and we want to approximate an exclusive and exhaustive categorization of that, that there are 5 pillars to consider. And the acronym for this is PERMA, and I'm going to, so I'll just say what it is, and then I'll tell you a little bit about each of them. The P is the usual hedonic view of what human beings want, the positive emotions, happiness, rapture, ecstasy, and the like. The E, and these are different from each other, I'm presenting a dashboard approach to human well-being as opposed to a final common path. The second is engagement, E, being one with the music, being entirely wrapped up in a subject. So time stopping for you. So just looking around at you, it looks to me that about 60% of you are actually in flow, engaged in what I'm, wholly engaged in what I'm saying. The other 40% of you are having sexual fantasies, it turns out. It seems to be the case. So the second element, the second pillar of well-being from my point of view is engagement. By the way, it's different from positive emotion. So if you actually stop people right in the middle of being in flow and ask them what they're thinking and feeling, the answer is typically nothing. Afterwards, they say, it was great. But Csikszentmihalyi and I believe that this state of attention required for complete engagement parasitizes all the cognitive and emotional resources that are normally deployed in the course, and that's why it's emotionless. The third is R, relationships, good relationships. The fourth is meaning and purpose, and the fifth is accomplishment. So the theory, to a first approximation, says if you want to know at a psychological level what free people choose, and you're trying to do it exclusively and exhaustively, then coming up with the 5 positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment is a first approximation to it. And I call interchangeably the 5 of these things together well-being or flourishing. And so the thing I want to talk about that is actually people who have started to measure flourishing in different countries have asked the question, what percentage of adults, in this case 23 European Union nations, are flourishing by PERMA criteria. I'll talk about that. And then having said, well, you know, people are starting to measure this, is it changeable? So one of the problems about interventions in psychology is they work for a short time and then you go back to where you were. So dieting, as you probably know, is a $50 billion scam. Any of you lose 5% of your body mass in about 3 weeks by following any diet on the bestseller list. But 80 to 95% of you will regain all that weight or more over the next 3 to 5 years. And so the question about the positive side of life is, can you actually intervene and have more PERMA in life or in the life of a nation, or will it just be like your waistline and revert back to its curmudgeonly baseline? And so what I do in real life is I ask the question, can you intervene on these things differently? So what I'll do in the next 10 minutes or so is I'll just take a small sample of probably 2,000 empirical articles in the psychological literature on the question of the measurement and building of each one of these. And what I'll try to do in the course of talking about those 5 things is give you a flavor for the empirical science that underlies the question of how to measure and how to build these. So I'll do that for positive emotion, for engagement, for relationships, for meaning, and for accomplishment. So I'm going to argue that these things are respectably measurable and that there is evidence that you can build them non-transiently. So having done that, I'll then ask the question, well, that comes, almost all of these come from work with individuals in which you take people, you have them identify for engagement, for example, their highest strength, and then you have them use their highest strength more, and you ask, what is the effect of that on well-being? There are effects I'll show you with individuals. So the question then arises, can you do this with more than individuals? Can this be done with larger units? So I'll talk about work in schools, and some of you may have seen the lead article in the New York Times Magazine last Sunday. It was about this work in schools. And then I'll ask, can you do it in very large organizations? And I will use as an example the one we work with is the entire United States Army. And can you raise PERMA in the entire United States Army? And then I'll close by, I'm a measurer, with the question of can this be measured? And finally, I want to talk in the spirit of what Ned and Asa have been writing about the politics of trying to work on the positive side of life. So that's what I'll do over the next 25 minutes or so. So I've already said what I think the elements of well-being are. As a first approximation for a psychologist, I'd like to say these are roughly the 5 things that free people choose to pursue. They can be measured exclusively of each other, and to a first approximation, I'm willing to argue they are close to exhaustive of what the basic pillars should be. The reason these interest me as an empirical scientist is that each of these things turns out to be measurable, and I'm going to contend each of them turns out to be buildable. You can actually have more positive emotion in your life than you have now. You can actually have warmer relationships with other people than you have now, and the like. So I'm going to make those claims. So one of the inspirations for this came from an epidemiologist friend of mine named Felicia Huppert, who runs the Center for Wellbeing in Cambridge. So she asked the question, if you take PERMA-like criteria and you look at 23 European nations, a minimum of 2,000 adults in each, and you have cutoffs for flourishing, are there differences? I should qualify this in one respect before I show you the data, although you're looking at it now. These are wholly subjective criteria of PERMA. So she asked people about how much engagement they have, how satisfied they are with their lives, do they have meaning in life. I'm very interested in the question of creating superordinate variables that merge both objective and subjective data. So the qualification. But the findings are that there are very large differences in the European Union. So 34% of Danish adults are flourishing by these criteria. About 17% of Brits are flourishing. Strangely, only about 9% of the French are. And then the former Soviet republics are all still in quite bad shape in terms of well-being and flourishing. So it was the possibility of doing that suggested in some ways it wasn't completely unreasonable to think of national policy in which your target is the building of well-being. And as some of you probably know, this is what David Cameron's administration seems to be pursuing. So I'm on the Prime Minister's Statistical Committee, as a couple of you in the audience probably are as well. And Cameron has suggested that he will measure flourishing, well-being, by criteria, which I'll tell you some of the arguments about toward the end, which are something like this, and most importantly, hold himself accountable for the success or failure of public policy, not only by its changes in GDP and unemployment, but by its changes in flourishing. So this is the sort of data that makes one think that this is not a wholly implausible public policy endeavor. So what I'm now going to do for the next 12 minutes or so is to run you through the 5 elements PERMA and to say just one thing about the science that goes on there. And this is partly in the following spirit. One of the things that people think about well-being and positive psychology is that your grandmother already knew everything about it, or your Sunday school teacher. So what I'm going to tell you here are things I didn't know 15 years ago when I started working in this domain. So I both want to give you a flavor for what the science does, but also for some of these to surprise you with things I didn't know about well-being. So the question of positive emotion. Marcel Losada and Barbara Fredrickson went to 60 different corporations, and they recorded every word that was said in the business planning meetings, and they simply computed the ratio, this is merely a correlational study, of positive words to negative words, and asked if the ratio correlated with how the company was doing economically. Roughly 1/3 of the companies were doing very well economically, 1/3 were doing stagnating, and 1/3 were going under. And basically what she found was that if the ratio was 4 or 5 to 1, that's where the companies that were doing well economically were located. Below 2.9 to 1, the companies were doing badly, and in a ratio of 1 to 1, they were typically going under. So there's the claim that there is a empirical ratio by which you can, which is a surrogate or a correlate of economic success in American corporations. Now, don't take this 2.9 to 1 home with you. So another group of my colleagues, John and Julie Gottman, lock couples into apartments for the weekend, and they measure everything that's said, and they try to predict divorce. So if you're at 2.9 to 1, you're headed for divorce, it turns out. So the Losada ratio for a marriage that's going to be stable and maybe even go uphill is about 5 to 1. And it's more complicated than that. About 3 years ago, my daughter, Nikki, who was then, I came home one evening and I was very excited about Losada ratios, and I talked at dinner with my family, and my 15-year-old daughter, about 11 that evening, came up to me, it was a Thursday evening, and wanted me to drive her to a party. And so I shouted at her, I said, it's 11 in the evening, go do your homework, I'm not going to. And she said, Daddy, you've got a terrible Losada ratio. which was, raises the question for teaching, for having children of different ages. What is the right ratio? And it's not just a number, because what's going on here mechanistically is, in order for someone to hear a criticism, to hear bad news, how much positivity do you have to build up in advance so that they don't respond defensively, so that's absorbed? And that's something of what's going on here. So that's a flavor of the kind of research that people do in positive emotion. In this group, I probably should have talked about the relationship of wealth to well-being, and that may come up during questions. But another domain in the positive emotion area is essentially the curvilinearity of wealth and life satisfaction. And I'll leave that for later. It's something that many of you think about and I think about as well. So that's the P. So let's do engagement. So engagement is when time stops for you, when you're one with the music. And here's an empirically well-documented exercise. I'll do half of it with you now. Close your eyes. Think of something that you have to do at work every week that you don't like doing. It's tedious or difficult. Okay, open your eyes. Okay, now that's half the exercise. If this had been an overnight thing, I would have had, by the way, part of my work is to give this stuff away. So there's a website called AuthenticHappiness.org, which is free. It's got the 20 leading tests of what I'm talking about today on it. And so what you would have done last night was to take what's called the signature strengths test. And you would have, about 1.5 million people have taken this test, so it's very well normed. And you would have found out what your 5 highest strengths are. And these are not talents. These are not things like IQ and perfect pitch, but they're rather things like kindness, fairness, social intelligence. And what your assignment would be to take that thing you don't like doing at work and do it using your highest strength. So let me just give you an example of what that means. So one of my, one of the person I worked with was a waitress. She hated waitressing. She was working her way through graduate school. She heavy trays and being patronized by customers. So she took the signature strengths test. Her job was to find a way of waitressing using her highest strength, which turned out to be social intelligence. So she recrafted waitressing to make the encounter with her the social highlight of every customer's evening. Now notice that she's going to fail most of the time, but what she's doing is taking what she's best at in the world and putting it on offer continually. And the trays became lighter and the tips became bigger. And when you do this on large groups of people, what you find statistically is 6 months later, you assign people just to do it for a week, 6 months later, statistically, the people who do that have less depression and higher life satisfaction. So that's a little bit of what goes on in the engagement realm. Relationships. None of you are any of you marriage counselors by any chance? Yeah. Marriage counseling is the worst of the therapeutic professions. It has the lowest success rate. People are lying to you, they're lying to each other. Sometimes they unite in hating you and then things go a little better. And what you try to do in marriage counseling generally, if you read marriage manuals, and what I used to teach my students to do, was you try to get people to fight better. You don't want them to have the same fight every time in a different guise. So what you're trying to do is take insufferable marriages and make them barely tolerable. So about 8 years ago, a group of positive psychologists, marital therapists said, let's not look at how people fight, let's look at how they celebrate together. And let's see what that predicts and if that's changeable. So your wife comes home and she's been promoted at work. She tells you about it. what do you say to her? Well, it turns out there are a 2x2 that describes what people say. So you can do passive constructive, which is what I did until I read this literature, which is, congratulations, dear, you deserve it. That has no effect. You can do active destructive, and when I tell you about training thousands of sergeants in the United States Army, this is what they do. You know what tax bracket that's going to put us into? You can do passive destructive, which is what's for dinner. The only thing that works, and it turns out when you train couples to do this, it increases love, commitment, decreases the probability of breakup, is active constructive. And active constructive takes a while, and it does not come naturally. It goes something like this. You know, dear, I've been reading the reports you wrote to the company for the last year, and the one you wrote last month on the pension plan is the best financial document I've seen in my 25 years of working with corporations. Now, exactly what did your boss say to you when you were promoted? And you get her to tell you exactly. You're trying to have her relive what happened. Now, where were you? Why do you think the real reason is that you were promoted? And you get her to say what it was. And he said, well, how can you use that in other domains of your life? And let's go out to Beck Fan and celebrate. So it turns out that that technique, tested empirically, builds love, loyalty, friendship, relationships. So that's a flavor of the skill learning that can go on in relationships. Meaning. So for me, meaning is not a mysterious concept. It's, I think as Bob Nozick said, it's belonging to and serving something you think is bigger than you are. And so the question is, can that be built? Can you have more meaning in life? And I've become, for several reasons, to think that meaning is more important than many of us thought it was in psychology. For one thing, its absence seems to be the best predictor of suicide that we have. But on the positive side of life, one thing, this is something you all know, but your students and your kids probably don't. So we have an exercise in which next week, do something fun that brings you pleasure, like masturbate or go to a movie or hang out with your friends, and do something altruistic, philanthropic, and write it up. And what you find is a very interesting regularity when people come back and report this. And it's basically when they do something fun, there's a square wave offset, that when it's over, it's over. But when they do something philanthropic, something very different happens. So emblematic, one of my undergraduates did this during her midterm week, and her 9-year-old nephew called her on the phone and needed to be tutored in fractions. So she spent 2 hours on the phone tutoring him in fractions. And she said, after that, the whole day went better for me. I was mellow. I could listen to people. People liked me more. And one of my Wharton students then said, you know, I'm at Wharton because I want to make a lot of money. And the reason I want to make a lot of money is money brings control, security, and happiness. But I was astonished to find out that I was happier helping another person than I was shopping. And that turns out to be a surprising regularity. So if I would guess that about 10% of you are depressed right now. If you want to do one thing 2 hours from now that's probably the biggest lift you can get from depression, is go out and help somebody. We're wired that way. The hedonic system is wired that way. So that's a flavor of what goes on in meaning. And the last one, accomplishment. My colleague Angela Duckworth is interested in something we call grit. Grit are people who, I've been interested in perseverance all my working life. Grit is extremely perseverant people. These are people who never give up. And there is a grit scale on AuthenticHappiness.org. And so the question is, what are the properties of very gritty people? So we go to West Point. West Point has 2 months of something that used to be called Beast Barracks before, very difficult stuff. And we ask, can we predict who's going to quit and stay with it? And the people at the bottom of grit, holding constant all the other variables, are the people who give up. If you look at undergraduate and high school grades and you measure IQ, then it turns out self-discipline and grit account for about twice as much of the variance in academic performance in high school and college as does IQ. And then spelling bee, Angela, 2 years running, took the 172 finalists of the National Spelling Bee, and she measured their IQ and she measured their grit, and both times, based on grit, it predicted the 4 finalists. So that's a flavor for the work on accomplishment. So what I've said in the first 2/3 of my remarks is that I believe that the notion of well-being can be approximated by PERMA, positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment, and that it turns out there is reason to think these things can be built and that these things can be measured with psychometrically respectable ways. So the question that will occupy us for the next 5 minutes or so is, can you do this on more than individuals? This is a plausible corporate or even national or planetary goal. So we work in schools, and we essentially teach PERMA in schools. We started off by doing middle school children. So we took 6th, 7th, and 8th grade kids, and we developed a course on what I've been talking about and what's known about the interventions at the middle school level. There have now been more than 21 replications of this across the world. The UK has just done it. These are controlled experiments in which you do. So it's what you do is you give 12 weeks of training, typically 90 minutes a week, and then you measure the kids for the next couple of years on depression, anxiety, well-being. We've done this in North Philadelphia. We've done it in very wealthy schools. And importantly, when we first did it, it was my graduate students who did this, but then importantly, we knew we couldn't disseminate it. It was my graduate students, so we developed a training course for teachers. And then in the 21 replications, what you do is you teach the teachers the PERMA techniques that you've gotten a flavor for, and they teach the children, and then you measure the kids for the next couple of years. And children learn to handle stressors. They learn realistic optimism, assertiveness, and decision-making. And what you find is that for the next couple of years, the probability of depression and anxiety is significantly lower. And we've also found that when you do blind ratings by teachers, I should say, we not only do standalone courses, but we integrate it into, this is 9th grade literature. Those of you who know the 9th grade literature stuff know that the canon is Lord of the Flies, Death of a Salesman, Romeo and Juliet, Scarlet, one tragedy after another. So in this, you have 24 weeks of literature. It's randomly balanced, either with or without positive psychology. And so when you read Lord of the Flies, that Friday you get 80 minutes on kindness, and then the next Wednesday you have an assignment to do 3 kind things. And then what you do is you measure the kids for the next couple of years. The social skills rated blindly by teachers of the kids who have been through literature with positive psychology is higher, their zest for learning is higher, and their grades are higher. About 10 minutes left. With this data being circulated about 3 years ago now, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, George Casey, called me the Pentagon and said suicide, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, divorce, substance abuse. What does positive psychology say about that, Dr. Seligman? And it was a meeting of the general staff. And I said the reaction of human beings to extreme adversity is Gaussian. And on the left-hand side of the bell are people who fall apart and whose lives are ruined. And you just gave what ways we label that these days. The great middle, though, are people who are resilient. And those are people, what resilience means operationally is these are people who go through a tough time in combat or in divorce, but 3 months later, by our psychological and physical measures, they're back to where they were. And then on the right-hand side is the little noted but widespread phenomenon called post-traumatic growth. And these are people who often go through a very tough time, but a year later, by our measures, are stronger psychologically and physically than they were to begin with. The people of whom Nietzsche said, if it doesn't kill me, it makes me stronger. Real human phenomenon. So my advice, sir, is to move the entire curve toward post-traumatic growth. And he said, he then did two things which I'll never forget. One, unlike what you and I do, in which we try to coax our colleagues into doing something, he ordered that from that day forward, positive psychology and resilience would be measured and built in the entire United States Army, and he would create an army that was just as psychologically fit as it is physically fit. And he allocated $145 million to doing this. So that's sort of what I do in my day job, although it's free these days. We had to create a test. So this is called the GAT, the Global Assessment Tool that all 1.1 million soldiers take once a year. And so this is a test of PERMA, essentially, along with all the usual risk factors. And we now have 1.1 million people. We're marrying their medical and performance records going forward. This is the kind of thing it predicts. As you may know, there are 1,200 colonels, and 33 of them are promoted to brigadier general every year, 1 in 40. And we asked they've all taken that, we asked, could you predict from the strengths part of the GAT who's going to be promoted? And you can read the numbers here. You can robustly predict who's going to make it to brigadier general. The form of teaching of this, oh, by the way, this is the second thing that General Casey said. He said, we've read the stuff on positive education, and we see that you teach teachers the techniques of PERMA, and then the teachers teach the students. Well, that's the Army model. And I said, really? He said, yeah, we've got 40,000 teachers in the Army. I said, really? He says, yeah, the drill sergeants. So your job, Dr. Seligman, will be to train all the drill sergeants in these techniques, and they will train the entire Army. So this is indeed what we've been doing for the last 2.5 years. 180 drill sergeants come to the University of Pennsylvania for 10 days every month, and we teach them this stuff, and they go off and train the Army. And we've now got large-scale data on soldiers in deployment and not in deployment who have gotten this training. And what you find is that indeed the soldiers that have gotten the training on the internal variables, less catastrophic thinking, better coping, higher flexibility, do better. So there are good initial results of the training. So I'm coming to my last 5 minutes, which is the issue of measurement, something that economists and psychologists are serious about. Those of you who know the life satisfaction wealth literature know that PERMA is typically measured by self-report. I have a lot of reservations about self-report measurement. And so I'm quite interested in, for each of these variables, constructing superordinate subjective and objective variables to measure each of these. Indeed, this is the main argument between this is main argument going on in Whitehall now. As part of this endeavor, I'm not going to have time to talk about it today, is using these variables to predict cardiovascular and health outcomes. And that's an entire lecture in itself. And there is indeed, for cardiovascular, reason to think that the high PERMA variables holding risk factors constant are significant health assets. Quite important, since you can build those things. My economist friend Richard Laird and I have the following dispute, and this is what a lot of the Whitehall dispute is about. Richard wants to argue that there is a final common path of all of the things that free people choose to do, and it's called life satisfaction, or happiness for Richard. I don't think that makes sense. And indeed, if you think about an airplane, there's no one number that tells you how an airplane is doing. Depending on the mission, there's the gas gauge, the altimeter, the wind speed, the RPMs. And what you have to do to know how an airplane is doing is to integrate across the whole dashboard. The same thing is true, even more so, in your own life. Hence, I very strongly believe that PERMA, each of these 5 things, are a much better way of going about measurement in individuals and in populations than life satisfaction. And the final teasing piece of empirical data I want to show you, just science fiction, is the way that Gallup or David Cameron measure how a nation is doing is the Prime Minister's group is making 200,000 phone calls once every 3 months, and they're asking you, how satisfied are you with your life? How satisfied are you with your health care? Does your life have meaning? Well, that's okay. It's expensive, and it's got all the faults of self-report survey data. But interestingly, PERMA has a lexicon. In fact, there are 2,000 words in English that are PERMA and anti-PERMA words. So for positive emotion, happiness, joy, rapture, and so on, and 45,000 phrases. So we are collaborating now with Google, Facebook, and other organizations to comb through these vast corpuses measuring the frequency of the PERMA and anti-PERMA words, asking, can you conceivably measure the well-being of the planet in real time by merely looking at what people actually say, what they freely emit in the social media. And I'll just show you data we just got yesterday. Is by no means representative, and take it with a grain of salt. So here's the texture of this data. We've got these 47,000 terms. And what we're combing through here is 1.1 million blog posts for these 47,000 words. And you're looking, and this is just the E, the engagement, you're looking at those 5 top words, the frequency of alive, compelled, creative, motivated, and awake, in these 1.1 million blog posts. And what you're correlating that with is the CDC publishes a national yearly poll on, are you limited physically in your activities? And there are only 49 degrees of freedom because they publish this by states. So people in Mississippi and West Virginia are more limited than people in Wyoming and Colorado. But what you do here is you correlate the frequency of these words with the rank order of these 50 states. And your correlation here is remarkably large, 0.54. So I'm going to finish now by talking about the politics of this. And this, I think, is close to what Ned is after, and it may be why he suffered to have me here. When nations are at war, in famine, in civil discord, it is perfectly natural that their policy concerns should be defense and damage. What happens when nations are wealthy and not at war and in relative civil harmony? Well, it turns out in human history there are a couple of examples of that. And the emblematic one is Florence of the 1450s. So Florence, as you know, became enormously wealthy, Medici banking genius essentially in the mid-15th century. And under Cosimo the Elder, they asked the question, what should they do with their surplus? And the generals said we should conquer the peninsula. But Cosimo and his friends decided that they would devote it to beauty. And they created what we 200 years later called the Renaissance. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that national policy I think we're at a Florentine moment. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should go out and do sculpture, but rather, I believe what we should invest in is perma. And I think this is apolitical and it's independent of what economic system you believe in. It rather says, it's not left or right, which for me is what means to the ends that we accept. It says there's a different end of national policy, and the end is well-being. So I believe that every human being can say yes to more positive emotion in life. Every human being can say yes to more engagement at work with the people they love. Every human being can say yes to better relationships. Every human being can say yes to more meaning and purpose in life. And every human being can say yes to more accomplishment. I believe those 5 things are measurable, that they're buildable, and they represent reasonable national policy goals. Thank you. Do we have 5 minutes for questions, I think?
Are there any questions?
Yeah.
Would you repeat the point
About
about Florence?
Florence.
And only because a good description of Florence at the time would be to point out how precarious those lives were, how much fear was associated and attached to political relationships, about the health, the biological health, the problems that they had.
Indeed, Florence was not paradise, but compared to Florence of 1350 or to London at the same time, on dimensions of civil harmony, being at peace and wealth, they were doing very well. And so what I'm contending is that when nations are in those circumstances, and I think we're a lot better off than Florence of 1450 was by the measures you talked about, that's when people ask questions not just about defense and damage, but about well-being.
But you're making a causal claim that PERMA then gives rise to a type of, say, complexity of culture that attaches to a word like the Renaissance.
Yes, this is a causal hypothesis, and it is that under conditions of wealth, abundance, non-war, non-famine, that people ask questions about what is above zero in life. It's a causal hypothesis, and Florence is meant to make it a little more plausible than being completely wild.
Another question? Yes.
Can I ask why these 5 things? They look very good 5 things, but if given half a day, I imagine I might invent another 5 things, and tomorrow 5 more. What's the particular, you must have some meta-level theory that leads you to believe that these are the 5 things.
Well, I wish it were a good theory, so I'll tell you how it came about. I spent 3 years with colleagues asking the question from the list of about 100 things that are claimed that people choose to do, what was the most efficient way you could boil them down to a reasonable number. So, for example, you might say, well, how about health? Why isn't health on the list? And so the debates that occurred, I won't walk you through them, is that we don't pursue health in its own right. We pursue health only in as far as it brings the other 5. So this is not to say that this is not amendable. It's the product of quite a lot of work and thought. There's a book called The Classification of Strengths and Virtues, which is an 800-page tome, which is the argument extensively. But the attempt was to get a measurable list that was small of exclusive, that came close to being exclusive and exhaustive of what free people choose to do. That's the attempt. Yes, sir.
Traditionally, many of the virtues have been called method.
Oh, you're Mark Taylor. How nice to meet you. Yes.
Have been cultivated in religious traditions. Does does religion factor at all in the analyses that you conduct?
Well, could you hear what Professor Taylor said? The role of religion. So that's what the M does for me, the meaning and purpose issue. So for me, meaning and purpose is belonging to and serving something bigger than you are. And it turns out empirically it's got all sorts of benefits.
A lot of there are moments when you sound like Maslow and some of the stuff too, in terms of...
Let me do one at a time. For me, for very many people, religion is the root to the M. Now, I must say I'm an anti-Maslowian. I very much like the idea that he was interested in very high flourishing and the like. But what I think turned out to be empirically wrong about Maslow was it actually was a hierarchy, and that if you weren't doing well biologically, you couldn't be interested in meaning or good relationships or what he called self-actualization. And in almost the way I said about Freud and Schopenhauer, I think that that's not empirically wrong, and I also think it's morally insidious. So people in Rwanda were not just interested in avoiding the next machete chop. They're enormously interested in justice, in the future of the Hutu and the like. So it's the hierarchical nature of Maslowian thought that I don't like.
Okay, we have one more question from Ian Golden. Ian.
Thank you very much. I found that fascinating. I'm interested if you have any data on the relationship between personal well-being and society well-being and global well-being. I mean, I'm fascinated by this Renaissance analogy because it was, of course, a time when they were searching for humanity's perfection. At the same time, it was the time of slavery, of inquisition, of the complete delegation to zero of women's rights, and many other things. And so how is it that something exists in that sort of dual, where people are striving for well-being, but for themselves, not for society or for the world as a whole? And can you try and put that together?
Well, I can grope toward it. So there are two things to be said about positive psychology. One, it turns out to be about other people. So as I joked, if you want to relieve depression, the single best thing you can do for a small kick is to go out and help another person. So it turns out that a lot of our self-hedonic system is wrapped up in other people. So if you think about the time you were happiest in your life, so for me, remarkably, when someone asked me that question, it was in 1980 at the end of the sixth game of the World Series when Philadelphia won the World Series. I was there for the first time in 100 years or something. I've never been happier. I don't care about baseball. I mean, but being part of that hive of 66,000 people is such a powerful the way we invest in sports, such a powerful demonstration that we're hive creatures as well as selfish creatures. And if you think about M, the meaning part of this, and I think there's a fair amount of data how important meaning turns out to be for well-being, that's about being part of something larger, belonging to and serving it. So I don't have a good answer to it, but I'm quite sure our flourishing and our hedonic systems are very much tied up in not only what we do for ourselves, but what we do for the hive.